Douglas, thank you for talking to us today. You wrote I'm not sure if this is an op-ed or just an opinion piece or just an analysis or what, in the Hill newspaper online a few days ago, and you were talking about the problem that Ukraine's intelligence has at this point, specifically the fact that President Zelensky has sort of shaken up his intelligence apparatus. And I'm wondering if you could tell us what you think led to that shakeup.
Well, there's a valid counterintelligence concern when it comes to Ukraine. The Russians have a lot of access and history there over the years, and they were working with the SBU, which is the Internal Security Service, the civilian service, for quite a number of years. I don't know necessarily that the timing of Zelensky's firing of Botnikov, the SBU chairman or director, is tied to any revelation of a new counterintelligence failing, or maybe just the political weight that he's been under, given criticisms that the SBU and his former chief have sustained, particularly for some of the failures in the early part of the war to preempt the Russians in their advance, particularly in the south, in the city of Kherson, where the SBU had the responsibility for destroying a bridge, which the Russians wound up using for a rather expeditious seizure of the city. But the problems there with the SBU in particular are historic. It was slower than other Ukrainian organizations to seek to remodel itself along a more progressive and Western line, and it's always been rather suspicious and the target for reforms among Ukrainian politicians and the population, which have been slow to come about.
Yeah, would you dig a little deeper into that the slow nature of the reforms as far as that organization go? Maybe just give us a little bit of history about the SBU's connection to the Soviet Union and the Kremlin.
Well, the SBU is modeled very much after the KGB, and in particular, the KGB's old Second Chief Directorate, which was responsible for counterintelligence and investigations. And as with most institutions in the former Soviet republics, Ukraine being no different, a lot of those agencies were still run by folks who were holding the same job in the former Soviet Union. So the composition of the management and the workforce of the SBU when Ukraine got its independence in the 90s were former KGB officers. And they simply just put on a different hat, and now they were Ukrainian KGB officers, but retitled as the SBU. The SBU, though, in particular, was rather uncomfortable with the West. I think its cadre was still very much in the KGB model. The organization was created to replicate the old KGB model, and they were rather suspicious of the West, the CIA, I know, in particular. And as we reached the new millennium and post 9/11 and even the Orange Revolution in the mid 2000s, which the SBU did contribute towards, it was still very much connected nostalgically and practically with the Russians. The Russian FSB, their internal security organization, still had a presence in the SBU, providing training and support and guidance up until Maidan in 2014. There was a great deal of sympathy. So they were not the most reliable service for the Western community to work with, which I think accounts very much for why U.S. officials have said that the U.S. intelligence community primarily is working with the GUR, which is the Russian military intelligence service in Ukraine.
So you said they're working with the GUR, which is the Russian military intelligence, but did you mean to say the Ukrainian military
I'm so sorry. Yeah, the Ukrainian military intelligence. The Russian intel service is the GRU. It's almost the same name.
Yeah, I can see how that would be an easy mistake to make. But so tell us what's different about the GUR as it relates to the GRU, aside from the fact that they're from two different countries and these two countries are at war right now.
Well, I think what the GUR sought to do was be more open to interaction with the West. A lot of Western support and cooperation, training, military training, intelligence support and training was channeled into the GRU, which was more receptive to remodeling itself and to try to look more like a Western government agency. It has an active social media, an online footprint. It tries to have a very pro-nationalistic narrative. It's far less suspicious of Western services with whom it's received a great deal of training and support over the years. So I think the experience, particularly post 2014, the training and cooperation from that time up until the February 2022 Russian invasion or offensive, we might say, really created more confidence in the exchange and the cooperation. And that's not to say the Ukrainian GRU is not itself vulnerable to Russian counterintelligence efforts and cyber attacks and penetrations. Like all of Ukraine, the Russians had the advantage of being there, of having historic relationships, of having access day in and day out to people in these Ukrainian institutions to target people for intelligence collection and also for influence. But it's been the better bet that Western services and principally the U.S. intelligence community has had over the years.
So do you think that the reason that this shakeup has taken place in the Ukrainian SBU has, I guess, more to do with the fact that there were leftovers, people inside this organization that might actually have been working against Ukraine because of their loyalties towards Russia? Or do you think it was just a matter of some simple housekeeping? Hey, we need to figure out who's where, who's doing what, and get people to think along the lines of where this country, Ukraine, is now and where it's going, as opposed to just the status quo or business as usual?
It's a confluence of those events, JJ. A lot of that generation that left the Soviet KGB have since retired and moved on. But and as much as the Russians were providing training and had a presence over the years, even the younger generations of the SBU would have been more susceptible to their influence and perhaps targeting by them. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government has gone on record about the number of treason and counterintelligence cases. I think it numbers over 1,200 at this point. And that's not all one specific institution. That's across the government agencies and across the population. But I think the SBU particularly was slow to reform, was slow to realign itself. His choice was a childhood friend and his campaign manager, but not really a career government service. And, bureaucracies in any country operate according to their own rules. So he didn't really have a network or experience to do that. Ukrainian parliament had passed legislation to try to reform the SBU to get it to focus its mission away from aspects which probably gave it too much flexibility to get into political business in terms of who to investigate and why, and to whom it was supposed to respond to. The KGB historically in Russia or Soviet Union responded to the Communist Party. So there was no Communist Party. There was a government for the SBU to respond to. But it's hard for some of these organizations used to operating secretly in a closed society to then operate in an open society. So from what we've seen publicly revealed, I think Zelensky probably had a threshold for the criticism the SBU was taking from the public, from the parliament. I think the number of counterintelligence cases and treason cases continue to tick up. And even if they're not within the SBU itself, that's their primary responsibility, is counterintelligence. They're the lead agency for that, for CI and for investigations. And clearly the numbers were disturbing. And whether there was a non-public component that we're not aware of, that the number of counterintelligence cases within the SBU was becoming too much to bear. I just think his choice to lead the SBU was probably not the right person, particularly for a wartime Ukraine. Certainly it's someone he could trust that wasn't going to use the SBU against him, but neither was he well equipped to really take on the problems of the SBU.
One of the things that Vladimir Putin wanted to achieve by invading Ukraine again, the second time, was to essentially take Volodymyr Zelensky out of the picture, essentially remove him from leadership. And I'm wondering, do you think that this organization, these people within this organization, would have been in a position to help him and Russian intelligence and the Russian military do that?
To a point, they would have certainly been a contributor to it. They're an internal counterintelligence agency. They don't necessarily provide all the protection. Zelensky has his own protection elements and own protective intelligence elements around him. But if you're the Russians and you're looking to take down the Zelensky government, even to enable doing it by force, which is what the plan was about going into Kiev, basically decapitating the government, you need multiple institutions. The Russians have had that kind of presence over the years that they could reach broadly across Ukrainian agencies, the military, right down to civil and public affairs, which would have been the work of the Russian FSB. Because, interesting enough, Russia assigned what's traditionally duties for a foreign intelligence agency to the FSB, an internal intelligence agency for Ukraine and all the former Soviet republics. I think that's more telling about the way Putin looked at the former republics, that they were still, in his mind, parts of his greater empire, parts of Russia, that he would assign it to his internal organization. The FSB would have tried to use their official presence over the years in Ukraine to identify agents across civil, public affairs, the military, and the SBU itself. So it would have been a component, but it wouldn't have been where the Russians would have placed all their money, but certainly an important player in their strategy.
One of the things that emerged when this phase of this war started in February of this year, one of the things that emerged was the fact that Russian intelligence and the military had been mired deeply in corruption. Many people knew that before and had talked about it before, but the inability of Russia's intelligence to tell or to figure out how to do what it wanted to do in Ukraine, even though they've been telegraphing that they were going to do this, do that. But the inability to figure out how to get it done suggested that, one, they, perhaps as a result of this corruption, were no longer positioned to do that kind of thing. But also it suggested as well that they had internal problems themselves with the decision making and what they were planning to do. So what do you think was the problem with the Russian military intelligence and, I guess, the whole intelligence picture for Russia when it came to this invasion in February of this year?
Corruption's been an affliction that Russia suffers and goes back to the days of the Soviet Union. And the way Putin has run his government, which is so replete with former intelligence officers, colleagues of his, or at least those from the KGB or former KGB in whom he had greater trust and reliability, that proliferation of corruption is simply a way of life, permeated, I think, every aspect of Russian bureaucracy in terms of the military, in terms of military hardware. But the intelligence factor, beyond questioning the competence of the Russian SVR, which is its Foreign Intelligence Service, GRU, its Military Intelligence Service, and the FSB, the Internal Service, which had the mandate for Ukraine, is sort of the cult of personality that Putin has created. Who is going to tell Putin bad news? Who is going to provide intelligence assessments that are going to contradict what Putin believes? And he very much believes heart and soul in a lot of what he's doing. And it seems a natural outgrowth that the intelligence would align itself to that. So that the FSB and the other intel services were not providing the most accurate picture, not only of Ukraine and what its resistance was going to be, the cohesion of the West and NATO in particular, the fact that Germany and Poland, of all countries, were going to take a strong stand against Putin and this offensive, because you're correctly pointing, it's an extension of an earlier invasion, isn't it? I think that he didn't exactly create a society of people who are going to, speak truth to power. And I think Putin very much started to buy into his own theories and propaganda, which happens with power and ultimate power corrupting, isn't it so? So the intel services certainly weren't equipped to tell him bad news, even if they were finding it. And that trickles down because it goes all the way down to the collectors on the street and the analysts who were in the cubby holes, putting together the information. They don't want to get in trouble with their bosses, who in turn don't want to get in trouble with their bosses. So he wasn't getting a real accurate picture. And that's sort of going to corrupt the intelligence throughout the cycle. By the time it gets to Putin, he's getting what he wants to hear, which in the case of Ukraine and the case of the posture of the West wasn't the reality.
Ukraine says Russia's lost 40,000 troops. Western intelligence suggests that it's perhaps closer to 15, maybe 20,000. But either way, that is a heck of a lot of people that this military has lost. And a lot of it is on the shoulders of bad intelligence. A lot of it is on the shoulders of bad leadership in the military. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of the people, I'm told, that are being thrown at this war are just not prepared for it. These are people that have been conscripted. And I heard Richard Moore, from the head of MI6, say the other day, these are not middle-class kids from St. Petersburg, but these are poor kids that come from the outposts of Russia, from the Far East and other places, Chechnya perhaps, I don't know. But the question I want to ask you is, Russia's, despite having an early edge in this war, appears to be losing right now. And it appears as though they're losing badly. Maybe not in terms of the landscape, where they're positioned, what they've taken and what they're losing, but based on what they set out to do and what they weren't able to do and where they stand now, not being able to use, they don't have precision weapons, they're running out of them, they're running out of troops, they can't hold territory. So the question I want to ask you is, does this look to you at this point like Russia's going to be able to hold out much longer in this war, or are they going to need to step back?
So Putin's calculus, and I think Director Burns has said this himself, as well as Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, is that the West does not have the same pain tolerance as Russia does, that it will become distracted or exhausted or just forget about Ukraine. He's not necessarily wrong. Those are all real vulnerabilities, I think, that exist. But you speak of numbers, and whether it's 15,000 or 40,000 dead, the Soviet Union lost over 40,000 dead in Afghanistan over a war that was years and years. This is months. So if we take the 15,000 case, which still you triple that for the number of casualties, those are just ridiculous numbers. Could you imagine the United States, the president of the United States, explaining to the public how we've lost 15,000 troops? We lost 7,000 combat dead in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria over 20 years. So Putin is not wrong when he says Russia has probably a greater tolerance and greater fear in the closed society that it is to sustain these losses, but it's not sustainable over the long run. And the question is, how does Putin define winning and losing? And you made a really great point, JJ. How does he even define victory? Certainly his goals have not been met. We can see that clearly, since his goal was get the Ukrainians to capitulate in 48 hours maybe, or at least take Kiev. He's had to redeploy, regroup, reorganize, and every time he does that, he has to adjust his narrative. Despite the constraints, despite the closed society, public opinion does matter over time, that saturation. And you made also other points in that he's tried to disperse the pain by bringing in Chechens, by bringing in minorities, Russian minorities anyway, to fight the war. So it isn't the traditional Russian middle class, if there is one. But how does Putin define victory? Does he define a war of attrition that he thinks he could extend for months or years as victory? Or is it clearly the battlefield? Because, yeah, he's taking losses on the battlefield, and we could define it and say, well, he lost this battle and lost that battle. But as we discovered, we won a lot of battles in Afghanistan. We won a lot of battles in Vietnam, but we lost those wars. If you look at it from stepping back strategically, he's losing a lot of battles, but if the West breaks first, if Ukraine breaks first, then he wins the war. So calculating victory and loss today in this multidimensional warfare and hybrid warfare and the importance of information is really a lot more subjective and tricky.
So one last thing, what's the headline here when you look at this war, how it's gone, where it's going, and then of course the reality of the world we live in today? What's the headline of this war and what people need to know and understand about what's taking place?
I think for people in the United States and the West in general, this is our war. This is not Ukraine's war. This is Putin attacking one of Europe's largest countries, a country that was aligning itself with the West and moving towards a pluralistic society. And Putin is not going to stop there. He's been very transparent over the years about his goals. We kept looking for resets, giving him off ramps, face-saving ways, trying to bring him into the world economy and make Russia so interdependent on the West that it would seem not to be in its benefit to jeopardize that. But Putin is from another time and another era. He's a KGB trained and conditioned intel officer who sees not so much a question of legacy, but what he believes is Russia's due and what Russia is owed, this victimization that Russian history has at times had over the last 200 years. So when you look at Putin, thinking in terms of our logic and practicalities, you've really got to dispense with that and look through his eyes. He seeks to have Russia be an empire, a dominant empire that could take what it wants when it wants. And that means taking from us. And that means we are fighting a war right now through Ukraine that we would have to fight ultimately anyway if Putin is not stopped. And I think the gravity of that has still not yet been embraced and accepted. It's more about look what he's doing to those poor Ukrainians. It's look what he's doing to us and look what he will want to do to us if he's allowed to.
And my very last thing, you wrote a book about a year ago. It's called The Recruiter. Tell us about that book.
Well, that book spoke to juxtaposing what the CIA transitioned to after 9/11 to what it was, which really was an elite spy service, an analytics service that had a charter for covert action, but covert action when the last possibility and no one else could do it, and it was to avoid greater wars. My book spoke to here's the art of espionage and here's how it has changed in 20 years, where the CIA aligned itself with much more a paramilitary mission to support the counterterrorism battle, which became the focus of not just the agency, but all U.S. national security, and how it had to make certain reforms, and reforms in terms of tradecraft, investing back again in being an espionage service, in diversity to reflect what we are as a society, which actually makes us richer to operate in every clime and place abroad, where an old white guy like me is not going to be as effective as someone who looks the part, who speaks the language, who has the history. And frankly, I've been kind of encouraged by some of what I've seen the agency doing in the last 2 years, by its being more agile, more aggressive, more focused on foreign intelligence collection, and embracing as well inclusion and diversity. So, I'd like to think that Director Burns read my book and went, that's what I'm going to do. But more likely, it's because these were all the right choices to make. And the agency still has some way to go. It still has some accountability for some of its sins of the last 20 years, but it's an amazing organization, which my book speaks to. It's an art of intelligence that it practices extremely effectively. And I think, and ideally, we're back on that pathway again.
Well, thank you. Sounds like a great book. To that issue about diversity and where the agency is going, you perhaps know this better than anybody. This didn't just start recently, within the last couple of years, since George Floyd and all of the concerns that have arisen in the last few years. I remember speaking almost 17 years ago to an executive at CIA named Ricky Jasper. And one of the things that we talked about was CIA efforts at that time to bring in a more diverse workforce to look more like the people that it was trying to engage, deal with, and of course, America. So I'm not surprised that this is happening at CIA. Douglas London, thank you for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you, JJ. Pleasure as always.